These are the most brutal true stories of settlers captured by Native American tribes, where survival meant enduring unthinkable torture, forced marches through hellish wilderness, and impossible choices between life and death. Women burned alive, children raised as warriors, men executed in ways history tried to erase. These 5 true captivity stories from America's frontier will shock you to your core. In June 1782, a respected Revolutionary War officer named Colonel William Crawford led nearly 500 volunteers into Ohio's wilderness. Their mission was to stop Native American raids on frontier settlements. But what began as a military expedition would end in one of the most infamous frontier tragedies. Crawford's men marched deep into Shawnee and Delaware territory near the Sandusky River. The native warriors were waiting for them. They were still angry about the Janaden massacre, months earlier where peaceful Christian natives had been killed. On June 4th, the warriors launched a surprise attack. Crawford's forces were overwhelmed. In the chaos, Crawford and several others became separated from their troops. After 2 days lost in the woods, Delaware warriors captured them near what's now called Crawford's Run. What happened next was recorded by eyewitness Dr. John Knight, who was forced to watch. The Delaware warriors, following their customs of dealing with enemy leaders, subjected Crawford to traditional punishment methods. They tied him to a post and used fire in a prolonged manner that caused extreme suffering. Crawford showed remarkable courage throughout the ordeal, which lasted several hours before he passed away from his injuries. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a deliberate message. After years of broken treaties and violent conflicts, the native tribes wanted to show settlers the consequences of invading their lands. When news of Crawford's fate spread, it shocked the colonies. Some used it to justify more attacks on native villages, while others began questioning the cycle of violence on the frontier. Colonel Crawford's fate proved one terrible truth. On the frontier, captivity was often worse than death. But 85 years earlier, an even more shocking story began in the Puritan settlements of New England. While Crawford faced warriors on open battlefields, one woman would survive an unthinkable test of motherhood and revenge. Her name was Hannah Dustin, and what she did to her captors would make history and nightmares. New England, 1697. The frontier village of Haverhill, Massachusetts, was a fragile outpost in a land still ruled by native tribes. For years, the Dustin family had survived the bloody clashes of King William's War, until one March morning when everything changed. 39-year-old Hannah Dustin had just given birth to her 12th child. As she recovered in bed, her husband Thomas worked the fields with their other children. None of them saw the war party approaching from these forests. The first war cry came just after sunrise. Thomas Dustin barely had time to grab his musket before 20 Abenaki warriors burst from the tree line, while he managed to save 7 of their children. Hannah, still bleeding from childbirth 6 days earlier, couldn't outrun them while clutching baby Martha. What happened next was recorded in the Massachusetts Bay Colony archives. A warrior tore the infant from Hannah's arms and dashed its head against an apple tree. The same tree still stands today in Haverhill, its gnarled roots watered with Puritan blood. Within minutes, the warriors had killed 27 settlers and taken 13 captives. Among the prisoners were Hannah, her nurse Mary Neff, and 14-year-old Samuel Leonardson, a boy already held captive for months. As smoke rose over Haverhill, the survivors were forced northward into the wilderness, their hands bound with strips of bark. For 15 agonizing days, the captives trudged through melting New England snows. The warriors gave them just enough food to keep moving, a handful of raw cornmeal here, half-rotted fish there. At night, they were forced to watch as their captors celebrated with stolen goods from Haverhill, including the Dustin family Bible. The route took them up the Merrimack River into modern-day New Hampshire. Contemporary accounts describe how Hannah, despite her weakened state, carefully memorized every landmark. She noticed when the warriors grew careless with their weapons. She saw how they became overconfident after weeks without pursuit. And most importantly, she learned their sleeping patterns at the fishing camp on Pennacook Island. April 29, 1697. The warriors made 3 fatal mistakes. First, they gave their captives tools to prepare supper. Second, they drank themselves into a stupor with stolen liquor. Third, they left a single tomahawk within reach of a woman who'd lost everything. When the last warrior's snores filled the camp, Hannah motioned to Mary and Samuel. What happened next was later testified under oath. 10 swift strikes in the moonlight, 10 bodies left bleeding on the riverbank. Before fleeing downriver in a stolen canoe, Hannah performed the grim task that would make her famous, collecting scalps to prove her story and claim Massachusetts' bounty. Hannah Dustin's story proved how quickly captives could turn the tables on their captors. But 7 years later, in 1704, another New England family would discover that survival sometimes required a different kind of strength. While Hannah fought back with brutal efficiency, Reverend John Williams would face an even more impossible choice when his captors demanded to abandon his faith or watch his children die one by one. This is the Deerfield massacre. Before we continue with the story of Reverend John Eliot, I have a quick favor to ask. I put a lot of effort into bringing these powerful stories to life, and my goal for this video is to reach 800 subscribers. If you're enjoying this content, consider hitting subscribe. It's free and really helps the channel grow. February 29, 1704. Before dawn, a mixed war party of French soldiers and Mohawk warriors emerged from the frozen Connecticut River. They moved silently through knee-deep snow, surrounding the palisade of Deerfield, Massachusetts, the northwesternmost English settlement in the colony. Reverend John Williams, asleep in the minister's house, awoke to the sound of splintering wood and war cries in 3 languages. The attackers knew exactly where to strike. They battered through the town's weak eastern gate, where snowdrifts had piled against the palisade. Within minutes, flames engulfed half the village. Williams managed to grab his musket, but a Mohawk warrior burst through the bedroom door before he could fire. The minister watched helplessly as warriors killed 2 of his children instantly, 6-year-old John Jr. and 6-week-old Jerusha, still in her cradle. Then they clubbed him unconscious with the butt of a French musket. When Williams regained consciousness, Deerfield burned behind him. 47 villagers lay dead in the snow. 112 captives, including his wife Eunice and 5 surviving children, were being force-marched north toward Canada. The February cold proved as deadly as their captors. On the first night, William's wife faltered in the snow. A warrior's tomahawk flashed in the moonlight. Her body was left unburied beside the frozen Connecticut River. For 300 miles, the survivors trudged through the worst winter in memory. The Mohawk gave captives just enough food to keep moving: frozen cornmeal and strips of bark. Those who couldn't keep up were killed instantly. Williams later wrote of passing trees where warriors had tied elderly captives and used them for target practice with their new French guns. At Fort Chambly near Montreal, the captives faced their cruelest ordeal. French officers offered Williams a choice: convert Catholicism or watch his remaining children be sold to different tribes. Meanwhile, his 7-year-old daughter Eunice was taken by the Mohawk to Conowake village. The warriors gave her a new name, Wongoat, and told her she would become Mohawk forever. For months, Williams refused to abandon his Puritan beliefs, even when the French threatened to send him to the galleys as a slave. Then came the news that shattered him. Little Eunice, now called Marguerite, had been formally adopted by a Mohawk family. She was learning their language, wearing their clothes, forgetting her English past. After 2 years of negotiations, Williams and 4 of his children were ransomed back to New England, but Eunice remained with the Mohawk. She would later marry a warrior and refuse all attempts to bring her home. Williams died without ever seeing his daughter again. Reverend Williams' story showed how captivity could erase identities across generations. But 70 years later, in 1779, another family would discover that children often paid the highest price on the frontier. While Williams grappled with his daughter's conversion, the Martin sisters faced something worse: being sold as slaves to rival tribes. Their childhood torn apart by the American Revolution's forgotten violence. July 1779. In the shadow of the American Revolution, 5-year-old Elizabeth and 7-year-old Rebecca Martin played by the creek near their Kentucky fort when the Shawnee War Party struck. Unlike Deerfield's organized assault, this was frontier violence at its most chaotic. Warriors splintering into the settlement from all directions, their faces painted black for war. The girl's father died in the first volley, his rifle still unfired. Their mother made it 3 steps toward the children before a tomahawk found her spine. The sisters were dragged away so quickly that Rebecca later recalled, still clutching her doll when the fort smoke disappeared behind the trees. For weeks, the sisters were marched northwest along the Scioto River. At night, they slept tied together with deer hide ropes. By day, they endured what Rebecca would later call the walking hunger. fed only handfuls of parched corn, their bare feet leaving bloody prints on flint-strewn trails. The turning point came at a slave market near Chillicothe. Elizabeth was sold to a Wyandotte family, Rebecca to the Shawnee. As her sister was led away, Rebecca bit her captor's hands so deeply he scalped her in retaliation, leaving a permanent bald spot the size of a silver dollar. Elizabeth's new family treated her as a replacement for their dead daughter, dressing her in traditional clothing and renaming her Fallen Leaf. Rebecca fared worse, beaten daily by her Shawnee owner, who used her as a pack mule for hunting trips. When British officers visited the Shawnee village in 1782, they found Rebecca chained to a post, her back scarred from punishments. She spat in their faces when they spoke English, the language of her murdered parents. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had fully embraced Wyandotte life, screaming and kicking when soldiers tried to rescue her in 1785. The sisters were finally reunited at Fort Detroit in 1786. 7 years after their capture, they stood 3 feet apart, staring at each other's unfamiliar faces. Elizabeth spoke only Wyandotte. Rebecca's English came out in broken whispers between Shawnee curses. Their story became a propaganda tool for both sides. Patriots pointed to Rebecca's scars as proof of native savagery. British loyalists used Elizabeth's resistance to argue natives civilized children better than colonists. Neither sisters ever fully readjusted. Elizabeth died at 17 in a drunken fall. Rebecca vanished into the Ohio wilderness at 21. Today, a single weathered grave near Chillicothe bears both their names, though locals whisper only one sister is actually buried there. The other's bones, they say, still walk the Shawnee trails on moonless nights. The Martin sisters proved how easily children could vanish into the frontier's violence. But 70 years later, another family would discover that the westward expansion had perfected cruelty. While Elizabeth and Rebecca endured the revolution's chaos, the Oatman family faced a new kind of terror, not from war parties, but from the merciless desert itself. Their story would become the most infamous captivity saga of them all. This is a tragedy that redefined the American West. March 1851, the Oatman family's wagon creaked through a narrow Arizona canyon, their last drops of water evaporating in the desert heat. 13-year-old Olive watched her little sister Mary and chased lizards in the dust, unaware that Yavapai warriors had been tracking them for days. The first arrow struck Royce Oatman through the neck as he reached for his rifle. His wife Mary screamed, a sound cut short when a war club crushed her skull. Within minutes, 5 Oatmans lay dead in the dirt. Only 3 survived. 14-year-old Lorenzo, left for dead with a caved-in skull, and the 2 sisters now being dragged into the mountains by their hair. For weeks, Olive and Mary Ann were marched barefoot through the Sonoran Desert. The Yavapai gave them rotting cactus pulp to eat and made them sleep chained to boulders. At night, warriors debated whether to kill them to save food. Little Mary Ann, just 7 years old, wasted away to skin and bones. Her final words were, "I want to go home," before dying in Olive's arms. Then came the transaction that changed everything. Traded to Mojave for 2 horses and some vegetables, Olive was given a new name and strange blue chin tattoos. The markings weren't decoration. They branded her as Mojave property forever. For 4 years, Olive lived as a Mojave. She forgot English. She dreamed in their language. When U.S. soldiers finally rescued her in 1856, she fought them tooth and nail. Because to Olive, these strangers were kidnapping her from her only remaining family. Back in white society, reporters gawked at her tattoos. Ministers called her deliverance a miracle, while ignoring her screams to be returned. Her reunion with Lorenzo lasted minutes before she begged to leave. The government then exploited her story to justify Native American removals, twisting her experience into propaganda. Olive died in 1903, but her true story was buried long before. Modern historians now understand her captivity reveals uncomfortable truths. The Mojave showed her more kindness than her rescuers. Her tattoos weren't savage marks. They were proof she'd been loved. Today, the massacre site sits silent under the Arizona sun. But if you listen closely, the wind still carries whispers of a sister's promise and a little girl who never came home. Olive Oatman made it out, but the trauma stuck with her forever. And if you think her story was wild, wait till you hear about the 3 most feared Native American warriors in history, absolute legends who had their enemies shaking. Click on the link to watch. You don't want to miss this.